Without a doubt, at the beginning of the war, it was one of the best tanks on the battlefield. Unfortunately, mass production began only shortly before the war, and just a few tanks were ready for the 1940 campaign in France. That is how Major General Foote, an experienced tanker who later commanded the 7th Royal Tank Regiment in the famous Battle of Gazala, recalled the debut of the infantry tank Matilda. The undeniable advantage of its thick armor and powerful gun allowed the newest tank of the British Army to gain fame in the sands of North Africa. But it could not stop the swift advance of the Germans. Let us try to understand why the reign of the Queen of the battlefield proved to be so short. According to General Foote, Matilda's first combat trial took place in May 1940. The tanks were transferred to the continent as part of the British Expeditionary Forces. The Germans began their offensive in the west on May 10th, and the British troops were deployed to stop the invasion. The baptism of fire for the new tanks was chaotic, and in many ways resembled the situation in the Red Army in the summer of 1941. Tank commanders and unit leaders were ordered to counterattack the Germans as quickly as possible, without any clear plan. There were few maps, and communication worked poorly. The radios on the new infantry tanks left much to be desired and constantly lost their tuning. Upon entering Belgian territory on May 12, 1940, radio silence was ordered before contact with the enemy. This turned out to be a serious mistake. The settings of almost all radios were lost during the 125-mile march. When the tanks entered battle on May 21st, it became clear that the radios on the infantry tanks were so out of tune that they were useless. Colonel Tom Craig, who held the rank of second lieutenant at the time of the battle, recalled, "I arrived in Petit Vimy on my tank, exhausted and confused. The company commander handed me a map and ordered me to start the engine and follow him. The radio was dead, there was no communication with the infantry, no clear orders. That was how we went into our first battle." By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, it became clear that the infantry would not arrive in time, and Major General Martel, commander of the 50th Division, decided to attack the Germans without them. At first, the infantry tanks fought quite successfully. They managed to break into the German column and destroy a large number of trucks and infantry. The German 37mm anti-tank guns were powerless against the thick armor, but the Germans reacted quickly by opening fire with divisional guns. The high explosive shells could not penetrate the tank armor, but several vehicles were disabled after damage to their running gear. Under fire, the commander of the 4th Royal Tank Regiment, Colonel Fitzmaurice, was killed. He had transferred to a light tank to use its radio. Also killed was the commander of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment, Colonel Hayland, when his tank came across a battery of anti-aircraft guns being used as anti-tank weapons. The anti-aircraft and divisional guns knocked out quite a few tanks, forcing the remaining forces to withdraw to their starting positions. The Germans quickly drove the British infantry from the village, infantry that had just arrived but was left without tank support. It cannot be said that the tank crews died in vain. The appearance of the heavy English tanks forced the Germans to regroup their forces and bought the most precious resource: time. Nevertheless, it became evident that armor and firepower alone could not win the battle. Next combat mission of the 7th Tank Regiment took place in the desert. The regiment arrived at Port Said in late September 1940 and was stationed east of Mersa Matruh. In North Africa, the tank crews under Lieutenant Colonel Jerem discovered a new weakness in their machines: low reliability. To preserve the lifespan of the running gear, Jerem ordered that the speed be limited to half the maximum until the tanks entered direct combat with the enemy. For the already slow Matildas, this was far from ideal, but the commander insisted on his decision. When urged to move the regiment to new positions immediately, Jerem replied, "I can be there on time with 25 tanks, or 2 hours late with 50. This time, no one planned to throw tanks straight into battle. The crews trained together with the infantry for several months, especially since the Italians on the other side of the front showed no desire to attack. By the beginning of winter, the Matildas were ready to take revenge. After 6 days on the road, 2 of which were spent on rest and repairs, at dawn on December 9th, the 7th Tank Regiment attacked the Italian Maletti Group. Here, the Matildas proved their effectiveness. The Italian defense was poorly organized, and they lacked heavy-caliber anti-aircraft guns. The only destroyed tank was lost after a direct hit into an open hatch. Another 22 tanks were damaged by mines or had their turrets jammed by shell impacts, but the Italians failed to penetrate the thick armor of the Matildas. The assault on another Italian stronghold also ended successfully, but the regiment lost many tanks due to mechanical failures. By the next morning, only 7 operational tanks remained. Fortunately, 4 more Matildas that had fallen behind on the march managed to rejoin. Repairs were carried out quickly. By December 11th, 17 Matildas had been restored to combat readiness, and by December 15th, 22, further attacks on Italian positions unfolded similarly. The armored Matildas boldly advanced, losing vehicles to jammed turrets and broken tracks. Yet worthy opponents did appear at times. For instance, on January 3, 1941, during the assault on Italian positions near the port of Bardia, a 4-inch shell struck the commander's cupola of Lieutenant Craig's Matilda. Craig's gunner was killed and Craig himself wounded, but the tank managed to withdraw from battle on its own. Unfortunately, the British were not destined to crush the weak Italians forever. In March 1941, Rommel's Afrika Corps landed in Africa, and by March 31st, the Germans attacked the British, advancing successfully from Mersa Brega toward Tobruk. The so-called wonder tanks did not help. The latest German tanks of the 3rd and 4th models had skirted armor that the British 2-pounder gun could only penetrate from close range. The Germans were also far superior in combined arms tactics. Their bombers and anti-aircraft guns efficiently destroyed the once invulnerable machines. The Italians, too, learned their lessons and began hitting the Matilda's undersides with anti-tank gunfire as they crested hills. The battlefield no longer always remained under British control, complicating the evacuation of disabled vehicles. On June 15th, the attack of the 4th Royal Tank Regiment's Matildas on the Halfaya Pass, nicknamed Hell by the British, showed quite convincingly that invulnerability could no longer be counted on. The defenders of the pass had buried a dozen 3.5-inch anti-aircraft guns in the ground, and these well-protected weapons proved highly effective. Only 1 Matilda out of 7 from C Squadron survived and was forced to retreat. A Squadron fared slightly better, but by the end of the day, it too had only 1 Matilda left. Once again, history repeated itself. The British failed to achieve their objectives and had to retreat, leaving behind Matildas that could have been repaired. In total, during Operation Battle Axe, the attempt to reach the Tobruk garrison, 64 Matildas were lost out of 100 deployed. When the military inspected the knocked-out tanks, it became clear that the thick armor was indeed effective. The additional armor plates on the sides could protect the running gear from the blast of a regular shell that exploded near the tank. However, one problem was noticed. The access hatches to the suspension were poorly secured and could be torn off during shelling. The suspension itself turned out to be quite durable. When the tank hit an Italian mine, only the tracks or wheels were destroyed. The suspension bogies usually remained intact. However, German anti-tank mines caused much greater damage. The suspension was completely destroyed and the hull became deformed. In 2 cases, cracks appeared in the hull armor after detonating such mines. Yet the crew inside these tanks remained uninjured and could continue to fire. According to eyewitnesses, some Matilda tanks exploded spectacularly when penetrated due to ammunition detonation. By this stage of the war, the British had already begun thinking about additional protection for ammunition storage inside their tanks. As a temporary measure, it was recommended to keep the shells as close to the floor of the fighting compartment as possible, and to prohibit carrying more than 100 rounds. The armor performed well under fire. Spalling was found only once among the examined tanks, on the rear side of an additional armor plate penetrated by a 50mm shell, about 2 inches. When a 50mm shell pierced the extra armor plate, it detonated without causing any damage to the suspension. The main armor of the Matilda could only be penetrated by a 50mm gun from a distance of 200 yards, about 600 feet. When fired upon from greater distances, the armor produced bulges and cracks on the inner side but was not penetrated. Such shells, however, could still pierce weak points in the tank's protection, for example, the gun mantlet. Yet an 88mm anti-aircraft gun, about 3.5 inches, left the Matilda with no chance of survival. The hull armor was penetrated from a distance of up to 1,000 yards, around 3,000 feet, and the turret from 1,800 yards, about 5,400 feet. Even so, after the additional armor plate was pierced, the main armor was not always breached. One recorded case involved a direct hit by a 105mm, around 4-inch high explosive shell. It shattered the armor of the air intakes and the gearbox. There was also an instance of the commander's cupola being penetrated by a 37mm gun, about 1.5 inches, which resulted in the commander's death. Specialized anti-tank weapons with conical barrels could penetrate the turret armor only at point-blank range. Older models of anti-tank rifles could not penetrate the armor at all. Due to the shape of the air intakes and the sealed hull design, bottles with incendiary mixtures posed no threat to the Matilda. The tankers of the 4th Royal Tank Regiment still considered the protection insufficient, since even fragments and bullets could pierce the spare parts boxes in the front of the vehicle. This often led to fires caused by the ignition of rags or wooden tool handles. To improve the protection of these boxes, the tankers covered them with cement. The tank itself was very well protected from bullets and fragments. In the 4th Regiment, by early February 1941, such a case had been recorded only once. On the other hand, it was quite easy to jam the turret with a successful hit on the turret ring. To counter this, a circular shield was welded around the turret, but the modification proved largely ineffective. Deformation of the ring could still immobilize the turret. Other improvised solutions turned out to be more effective. The gun mantlet could also be jammed easily, and the tankers demanded external protection similar to the German design. A weak point was the pistol port hatch. It was never used for its intended purpose and was only useful for ejecting spent shell casings. Tank crews believed that the visibility from inside the vehicle was insufficient. The tankers requested more observation slits and at least one additional periscope for the driver. There were frequent cases when the commander was wounded or killed while sticking out of the hatch. In such a situation, the loader became the commander, but this was very inconvenient. He did not even have a periscope. To improve the loader's visibility, the British were even ready to remove the gunner's periscope. The loader also needed a folding seat. By the way, they also wanted to get rid of the commander's cupola, replacing it with a rotating periscope for the commander instead. The designers listened to the feedback, and soon the production models were released with an additional periscope in place of the signal hatch and a lower, wider commander's cupola. The ammunition stowage also required modification. According to the tankers, it was too small for the 2-pound shells, and each crew had to manually enlarge the storage cells using files. The tanks carried more ammunition than the official load, usually 105 shells for the gun and 24 boxes with belts for the machine gun. Among the complaints, one was notably absent: ventilation. The ventilation of the fighting compartment was excellent. Unlike the Valentine or Churchill tanks, even continuous firing from the Bisa machine gun did not raise the carbon monoxide concentration above the permissible level. In those newer British infantry tanks, crews had to limit themselves to 9 and 4 fired belts within half an hour, respectively. Much more often than about armor or visibility, the tankers complained about the reliability of the vehicle. Frequent reports mentioned the tracks slipping off. Back in April 1941, the units were sent instructions on how to install them properly. Since the tracks stretched quickly, the first 50 miles of driving had to be done at a speed not exceeding 10 miles per hour, with stops to check the tracks every 440 yards. Otherwise, the tracks could not only come off but also tear off the drive sprocket's teeth. In November 1941, Matilda tanks received tracks with cast links made in America. The tension of this track had to be checked only every 2 or 3 miles during the first 100 miles of operation. It is unlikely that the driver mechanics followed such instructions because even if they had the time for such a long break-in, wasting the resource of the already unreliable Matilda on track stretching was unreasonable. The older type tracks wore out after 500 miles of travel but had better grip on the ground, so regiments tried to preserve the old tracks as long as possible. The service life of the running gear components was extended by limiting speed. The Matilda's speed was restricted to 15 miles per hour in combat and 12 miles per hour on the march. The British also began to install special deflectors to prevent barbed wire from getting under the side skirts. This often caused track damage and suspension jamming. During major overhauls in rear workshops, it was discovered that, without exception, all tanks accumulated oil and water on the floor of the engine compartment. Driver mechanics were instructed to regularly drain the liquid since its presence sharply increased the fire risk. And not only when the engine compartment was penetrated. Through gaps in the partition, the liquid could also reach the fighting compartment. Simply opening the valves and forgetting about the process was impossible, as they could easily get clogged. Water leaks themselves annoyed the soldiers because pouring out water in the desert was considered unacceptable waste. The distributed instructions to the troops had a positive effect. In the technical summary for the December 1941, it was noted that complaints about the Matilda had become much rarer. The author of the report did not have precise data, but according to him, the Matilda had gained a reputation as a reliable tank. In January, more precise data was gathered, and it suddenly became clear that the previous assumption had been wrong. The reports from the units were deeply disappointing. In the 4th Royal Tank Regiment, during a 40-mile march under normal conditions, 2 or 3 vehicles usually lagged behind due to technical problems. The work quality of Harland and Wolff, the company assembling these tanks, was criticized particularly harshly. The gearboxes, clutches, and suspension components were considered especially unreliable. After 250 miles of driving, the gaskets of the final drives began to loosen, and the bearings failed after between 250 and 600 miles. The clutch shaft on tanks equipped with AEC engines broke after about 250 miles. The road wheels and starter could not handle sand and required frequent cleaning. There were no complaints about the steering and braking mechanisms, but only because on the flat desert terrain, changing direction or braking was rarely necessary. The intercom system was deemed completely useless, as it failed after the first shell hit the tank, if it had worked at all before that. On the other hand, the number 11 radio set operated reliably. Despite this number of complaints, the command still considered the Matilda a dependable tank, provided that it was maintained by an experienced crew, cared for properly, and not driven too hard. The author of the report also recommended transporting infantry tanks on carriers rather than marching under their own power. Despite the general's arguments, the Matilda did not become more reliable. Compared with the American Grants and Stuarts, which had just begun to arrive in large numbers, the aging tank seemed like a relic of the past. The American machines could not boast of thick armor, but their guns were far more practical, and the Grant's armor could withstand a 2-inch shell, the same as the Matilda's. Most importantly, a regiment equipped with American tanks could arrive on the battlefield on time and in full strength. It is no surprise that by early 1943, the Matilda had almost disappeared from technical reports. Apart from 24 Matilda Scorpion mine-clearing tanks, all remaining vehicles in Africa were transferred to training units. The reliability of the machines was then rated as moderately satisfactory, though some problems still persisted, such as the loosening of gaskets, which continued to be tested up until January 1943. As many tanks had been written off, spare parts for the rest were easy to obtain, but the large number of unwanted Matildas was doomed to rust away at repair bases. The Matilda's armor was tested not only on the battlefield. The tank proved to be both well-armored and no longer in demand, which made it an ideal target for testing armor-piercing ammunition. For example, Matildas were used as targets for 3-inch anti-tank rockets of the unrotated projectile type. During the tests on the 10th and 11th of October 1942, 60-pound rockets were fired from a distance of 300 to 600 yards by Hurricane fighter bombers at the tank's frontal and side armor. On the first day, the pilots were unlucky. Because of strong winds, hitting the tank was difficult, resulting in 1 direct hit and 1 ricochet. The next day was calm and the shooting improved. Out of 19 rockets fired, 5 hit the tank's side armor, 4 of them after ricochets. Some rockets also bounced off the tank, but those that penetrated the armor produced a powerful effect. The first impact on the frontal armor occurred during firing from 400 yards, after a ricochet 40 yards from the target. The rocket failed to penetrate the armor, but the hit caused through cracks and a fairly large spall, about 3 by 1 inch, on the inner surface. Second hit from a distance of between 550 and 650 yards pierced the side of the engine compartment, leaving a hole about 3.5 inches in diameter and bending the armor. The projectile struck the opposite side, bounced several times, deforming the armor and destroying rivets. This penetration also caused many large fragments to break off from the inner side of the armor. Subsequent hits produced similar results. If the rocket penetrated the armor, the damage inside the tank was catastrophic. On October 21st, the experiment was repeated. This time, rockets were fired from a distance of 200 yards, aimed only at the side projection. 6 rockets were launched, of which 4 missed the target. One hit the rear edge of the turret side and another struck the front edge of the applique armor. The rocket that hit the turret did not penetrate the armor but turned the turret 40 degrees and partially tore off the towing hook. Specialists believe that in a fully equipped tank, such a hit would have broken the turret rotation mechanism and disabled the vehicle. The second hit was much more spectacular. The rocket struck the hatch flap on the applique armor and tore it off, creating a hole about 3.5 inches wide. After destroying the suspension balancer and the spring of another one, the projectile continued onward, piercing the right spare parts box and the main side armor of the vehicle, which caused spalling over an area 6 by 6.5 inches around the 3.5-inch hole. The floor of the fighting compartment was deformed, and 5 rivets were torn out. After bouncing off the opposite side, the projectile entered the fighting compartment and burned out there. The results were promising. The rocket's armor-piercing capability was sufficient to penetrate the side of a Matilda, and the entry of burning propellant into the fighting compartment of a fully equipped tank would undoubtedly have caused a fire. For the tank itself, however, these results were far from good. The slow-moving vehicle would have become an easy target for assault aircraft armed with such weapons. The quality of the armor did not prove ideal. Large spalling from the rear side of the armor, deformation of the armor plates, and rivets bursting apart at the seams meant that the tank could not be repaired, and the fragments would likely have killed the crew. In many cases, through cracks formed in the armor. Matildas were also used as targets for chemical anti-tank weapons. In December 1941, at the Porton testing ground, trials were conducted with a 2-pound hand grenade filled with tear gas. When the grenade hit the tank, vapors quickly penetrated inside through the periscopes. The crew of the affected tank failed to put on their gas masks in time and had to abandon the vehicle. Around the same period, on the other side of the Atlantic, Matilda's armor was tested against more traditional armor-piercing shells. On August 13, 1941, at the Aberdeen Proving Ground, Americans fired 75mm shells at a Matilda turret. The limit of penetration for the 3.2-inch cast armor was determined at a velocity of 4,626 feet per second, corresponding to a firing distance of 6,598 feet from a 75mm gun. A shot was also made from a 105mm howitzer. The high explosive shell hit the side of the turret about 12 inches above the hull roof. The armor was not penetrated, but the explosion tore off 3 rivets and deformed the roof, creating a gap of 0.12 inches between the roof and the side plate. 2 bolts securing the turret to the hull were also knocked out, although the turret could still rotate. 3 armor plugs knocked out by the armor-piercing shells were sent to a laboratory for analysis. According to American scientists, the steel contained too much carbon, 0.44%. and was too hard for its thickness, between 302 and 340 on the Brunel scale. The casting quality was also poor. The armor contained numerous microscopic cracks, and its structure was inconsistent. Acid etching revealed a noticeable amount of non-metallic inclusions due to poor casting processes. Excessive hardness and casting defects made the turret relatively easy to penetrate. The British carried out a similar shelling in December 1943. As a combat vehicle, the Matilda no longer held any real value, but the presence of an additional protective screen made it quite a suitable target for testing armor-piercing shells with explosive charges. A control shot was first fired from a distance of 1,500 yards, roughly 4,500 feet. The shell without a detonator pierced the tank's protective screen and main armor, struck the opposite wall, and remained inside the tank. Although it did not explode, the armor fragments struck all test dummies except the one positioned in the commander's seat. A shell with a detonator, fired from the same distance, penetrated 3-inch turret armor at a 25-degree angle. A crack appeared in the turret side, running from the point of penetration up to the roof. The protective screen saved the tank from full penetration at 4,500 feet. The shell exploded without breaching the main armor. However, from a distance of 1,000 yards, around 3,000 feet, the screen no longer provided protection. The shell pierced both it and the main armor, likely because the detonator had been damaged and failed to trigger. Another shell fired from the same distance ricocheted off the 2.8-inch side armor set at a 20-degree angle and shattered against the turret. The British conclusions about Matilda's armor quality matched the American assessment. It was noted that the armor's performance under fire was unsatisfactory due to the large number of spalls on the inner surface after penetration. Looking at Matilda's combat history, it is safe to say that the emphasis on armor did not pay off. The vehicle's armament and mobility did not allow it to either escape enemy gunfire or respond with effective fire. As often happens with supposedly invulnerable tanks, the advantage of Matilda's armor rapidly declined as tank and anti-tank artillery developed. The machine reached its peak effectiveness in battles against poorly armed Italian forces, but even there, the tank suffered heavy losses from mechanical failures, problems that persisted until the very end of Matilda's service in North Afrika. Nevertheless, many British officers after the war spoke quite favorably of the Matilda. The vehicle compared rather well with other British tanks of that era,